Strange. Let me see. Of course. Now I will hear you. Technology, my friend. Technology. The speaker. You make whole documentaries, and I cannot even turn on the speaker of my computer. So let's just see if Mike can join us. I gave him the link, so I'll just look in the list of participants for him now and then to send him to panel. Okay. But anyway, let's start, you and I.
That sounds great.
I had about 200 registrations, people following live, which is good on such short notice. And the goal of today is to just get to know the guy behind the documentary and the story, why you wanted to make the documentary. And then later on, my idea would be to peruse it a bit. Of course, I've just spent all my time watching every part. Yesterday, I watched 2 hours and a half, the first part, and then part 2, 3, 4, and 5, I watched since this morning, 6 o'clock with a coffee for me, just to have everything seen. And of course, I've been into this field of knowledge for a year and a half now. So for me, there was not really something new, but it's very good to see everything aligned, all the arguments in one place. And I think that the documentary will be a hit, to be honest with you.
That's nice to hear. Thank you, Brecht. It's also nice to have a conversation with somebody who's already aware of these arguments, because there's been such a censorship around even talking about these ideas. There's so much fear around even having these conversations. When I was making the documentary, there were even numerous anti-vax doctors who were too scared to even talk about this, to even have a conversation about this. So there's a really strong streak of anti-intellectualism that is afoot, and it reaches even beyond the monolithic government control. So it's great to be able to talk about reality.
Talk about reality, yes, not live in the virtual reality of viruses. Yes, it's very nice. I have seen that Mike has also showed up. Hi, Mike. Can you hear us?
Hi. Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah.
Is it going through okay?
Yes. On your end, it's -7 hours now, so it's about 8 o'clock, I guess.
Yes, you're correct.
You're calling from Iowa?
You bet. Midwest.
Okay.
And my Hawkeye shirt on and everything.
Beautiful, beautiful. Now we were just talking a bit, Michael. So I will call Michael, and Mike, the two Mikes. For people who do not know you, Mike, what is your activity? We decided to do a double interview. What do you do?
Well, sure. Well, I have a blog called Virology, VIROLIEGY.com.
Virology.
Virology, yes, with the lie in there.
Okay.
So I just go through various topics with the virus fraud, trying to break down the original papers and showing just the absurdity that they go through in order to try and claim that these invisible particles exist and cause disease. So I've just done my best to present it in a way that it's easy for people to be able to access and see the studies themselves. And, I'll put my commentary in there. They can read that if they like, or if not, they just want to see the studies and verify the information for themselves. They're there for them.
Good. Okay, we'll first start with Michael. That was the original intent of this interview. But then when we get down to the science behind that, I will come back to you. Of course, Michael also knows a lot, but I was especially interested in all the sections on your website on the visualization of the virus, because you can explain a lot to people, but one image says more than 1,000 words. And if they really see the virus or what they think is the virus, they say, well, we've seen it. So I will come back to you for an in-depth discussion of that, because the process of preparing a specimen for the EM microscope in and of itself is already very complicated. So it would be nice if we can shed some light on that. But now first to Michael. Yesterday in our preliminary conversation, I asked you not to tell your personal story, how you got involved in this, because I wanted it fresh. But now I'm very curious. You said it had to do with becoming a father. That's how you got into this movement. So please explain, please elaborate.
Yeah, it actually goes even before that. I think in a lot of ways, it really began when I was, when my wife and I were 30, and my wife suddenly developed knees that were inflamed, really giant knees, just would inflame for 3 or 4 days and go away. And then another knee would inflame and go away. And it was a real strange mystery, and it kept happening over and over and over again. And it was painful, and she was having difficulty walking. I mean, you know, beautiful 30-year-old woman, and all of a sudden there was real fear, and she went to 3 rheumatologists in New York City, and you know, very high-end rheumatologists at Columbia University, at NYU, and so on, and all 3 told her the same thing. They told her that she has early onset arthritis. There was fundamentally nothing they could do. The best thing that they could do would be to put her on a lifetime steroid treatment, and that she was essentially not going to be able to walk again the way that she could, the way that she used to. And she should invest in a good cane. I mean, one of the rheumatologists said you should buy a good cane. And I happened to, so she had a cane. I happened to be looking at, to be listening to an alternative radio station in New York at the time. And there was a doctor on there, and he sounded really brilliant. He was fielding phone calls. I was really taken with him. And it turns out he had resigned as the chief surgeon at a hospital in New York City because he was so fed up with the orthodox medical approach, and had formed a little practice in New Jersey. And so I said to Susie, why don't you give this guy a call? He sounds really smart, and it's worth a shot. We went in to see him, and he immediately asked her if she's a professional athlete. She said, no, I'm not an athlete. And he said, well, what does your bathroom look like? It's a strange question for a doctor to ask. And she said, it's funny, I hate my bathroom. He said, yeah, is the paint peeling on the walls? She said, yeah, the paint is peeling. He said, yeah, you probably have a mold allergy. We'll run some tests on your blood to see how allergic you are to mold, but probably you should just switch apartments and you won't have to worry about this at all. So we immediately switched apartments. We got out of there in about 2 weeks. That was 15 years ago. After we switched apartments, never bothered her again. She was completely fine. Had she taken the steroids that the orthodox doctors recommended, very likely that she would have done serious damage to her liver and died in her early 50s. That, to me, is not only why my eyes really opened up as to how to navigate the medical system, But there's just so many, for me, there were so many lessons in there about how we think about health and where sickness comes from, and what it means to be conservative about our health decisions. Because I think the most pernicious lie, the most pernicious slogan that has happened, and we'll get to the science and we'll get to how I made the documentary, but I really want to hammer at this one point, because one of the most pernicious slogans that has been out there since the beginning of the marketing campaign for this pandemic has been, it's the safe thing to do is to participate in our recommended behavior. So the safe thing to do is to wear a mask. The safe thing to do is to socially isolate. The conservative thing to do is to inject yourself with our chemicals. There were all sorts of protocols that were recommended to doctors that were considered or sold, marketed as the safe thing to do, the conservative orthodox thing to do. Well, if my wife had done the conservative orthodox procedures, she would have been on steroids her whole life. She would walk with a cane. She would not have improved her arthritis, and she'd be dead in her 50s. Okay, so I want to generalize because it's very hard for people to, for some people to recognize that
something's off.
That things are different. Oh, my son actually walked in the room here, so we can start talking about we can move on to the next phase. But that's what really inspired me to think differently about the medical system. And I remember this one thing he said as he walked out. He said, the Iraq War pales in comparison to the death that the new Enron Journal of Medicine has brought people.
It's a silent war. It's self-inflicted pain. It's because people believe that they're going to be helped, and it turns out to be the opposite. But it's a very pernicious way of, well, if we call it a war, then we are assuming that they are trying to kill us. I think that's another debate. But in any case, it's lethal. Iatrogenic deaths, I think they are listed as number 3 cause of death in the United States. And knowing how the reporting is done, I dare to say it might be number 2 or number 1 even, because diagnosis is a funny animal. But
oh yeah, anyway. I mean, if you're diagnosed with cancer, but they kill you with chemo, on your death certificate, it doesn't say chemo killed you; it says cancer killed you, right?
Yes.
But that's not actually why you died. You actually died from the chemo. This is what happened to my father.
Yeah, and that's a very nice touch in your documentary. Part 4 is on AIDS and on the chemical causes of that, which is something that you could not say because it was politically incorrect. And if you see how the big pharmaceutical companies actually paid the leaders of the gay community to, to shun everybody who even suggested that it might have to do with the poppers they were using that are very liver toxic, and the rashes you get and all of that. You see how the lobby works. It always tries to divert attention from the real cause, which is AZT, to my mind, taking repurposed chemotherapy in the form of pills. And these are stories that never get told, and that's why I think your documentary does a really good job of just joining it all together. And I suggest, before we continue, that we just look at a clip of it. The trailer you have is 5 minutes. That's a bit long, but let's take 2 minutes, and I will share my screen and just go to your website where anybody can see the trailer. Is that okay for you?
Sounds great.
Yeah, so let me just, the viral delusion, share. So now you should be able to see the website, and this is the trailer.
And that's when I just started saying, okay, let's figure out what's going on. I'm going to start at the very beginning. I'm going to look at the papers that discovered the virus and, you know, take it wherever it leads me. And I never expected to find that those papers didn't actually show any virus.
And the studies, and the most important studies, claiming that they have proven SARS-CoV-2, they haven't purified the particles. Without purification and finally isolation, you cannot say that you have found a virus.
There is no virus there. The CDC admitted last December they don't have any SARS-CoV-2 to compare with a PCR test to see if that's what it's actually detecting.
When somebody says, a virologist says, we have isolated a virus, I thought, as does everybody, that they took, 100 people or 500 people who are sick in the same way, right? They have a runny nose or a cough or pneumonia, and then you do steps, like you take their secretions, you then macerate it, and then you filter it, and then you centrifuge it, and then you have a band that has just those viruses. Right? That's what everybody thinks they did. And then you tell people the steps, so some other lab could repeat the steps. That's how you do it in science. And then everybody says, yes, this thing that we have is pure SARS-CoV-2 coronavirus. That's what every human being understands by the word isolation. And that's what every doctor and human being thinks happened in this case, right? Except it didn't happen once.
The government in this country is captured by the pharmaceuticals. They're like this.
All this testing and screening, all this, PhDs, all the rest of it, it's a dragnet for generating markets for drug companies.
This epidemic was caused by the spreading of the test.
We falsified the PCR test in a huge paper in December 2020, but the authorities have chosen not to ignore that.
There are contradictions. This is not true. This can't be true, knowing biology. This can't be true, knowing history. This can't be true, knowing where the concepts come from. And if looking into the details of virology, with this kind of information, you see the contradictions on your own.
Because this isn't about the science. COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2 is nothing to do with science. Otherwise, it would have all been debunked months ago.
Okay, so that is the trailer. I'll stop sharing my screen now. And a first topic that, well, the first and last topic actually, as far as I am considered, is that we talk about isolation. And if you really carry the debate to its philosophical premises, the debate has already stopped. You don't even have to talk about the PCR test. You don't have to talk about vaccination. You don't have to talk about the policies. That is the core of the debate, and I'm so happy that somebody actually touched it. So maybe you can elaborate a bit on how you discovered that isolation in the colloquial sense of the term is not what isolation means in biology. How did you discover that?
Well, through a number, through a number of ways. That's a good question. How did I come upon the isolation issue itself? I think it was Andy Kaufman who first pointed it out for me, mm-hmm. and so I remember he had put out a video called something with the river and the rooster of rats or something like that, and where he had looked at the isolation issue, and then of course the Perth group had looked at it during the AIDS period. So I pretty quickly came across their writings about it once I started looking into it, and then slowly it dawned. It took a little while because for the fog to sort of clear out. Mm-hmm. But I slowly started hearing it more and more. When I spoke to Jim West, who's one of the great polio researchers alive today, Jim had pointed out that the polio virus had never been isolated. So now we had in my experience, I was seeing Andy Kaufman point out that the SARS-CoV-2 had not been isolated. The HIV researchers, or the AIDS researchers, pointing out that HIV had not been isolated. Jim West about polio. David Crow had pointed out that the SARS-1 virus had not been isolated. It became pretty clear that there was no virus isolation going on at all. And at the end of the day, just so that people are clear on this, at the end of the day, I'm sure a lot of people know about Christine Massey, the activist who writes. So Christine Massey is an activist who writes to government institutions with FOIA requests, asking for all isolation documents that they have, all virus isolation documents that they have, and specifically any papers in which they've actually isolated a virus by the dictionary term isolation. She's written over 150 government institutions. Every time she gets the same response, which is no, we don't have any. But about 8 months ago, I think, she got a very interesting response from the CDC, in which the folks there sort of got fed up with her, with all of her requests, and they basically wrote to her, listen, you can't isolate a virus. It's not possible. It's outside the bounds of what is possible in the field of virology.
Yeah, and let's take that sentence, because I think for people who are new to this debate, what do virologists mean when they say that they have isolated? Because I don't think that they are lying. I think that they are believing in an illusion, which is something different.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And what do they mean when they say that they have isolated it?
Well, okay. So just so that people are very clear on this, right? The virologists start by taking like a nasal swab or a throat swab, right, from a human being, and they theorize that somewhere in that swab there is an evil little virus, right? Somewhere in there. That's the thinking. That's the theory. Okay, and that little thing is causing disease. Okay, but we have to step back and remember that you can't assume that that's the case. That's just an idea. It's a hypothesis, because disease can have all sorts of causes. There's a tremendous number of reasons why we can get sick. Go back to my wife, for example. It wasn't a virus that was causing her knee problems. It was mold in the bathroom. Okay, so there are just a tremendous number of reasons why we get sick. So they take the throat swab or the nasal swab, and they say that they have isolated a virus, essentially, at that point.
Yes.
At that point.
This is important. So the isolate coming from the patient is seen as the isolation.
Exactly. So they've switched, whereas according to the scientific method, you have to isolate your independent variable in order to do an experiment on a dependent variable, right? In order to figure out if X causes Y, you need to have X. you have to have X on its own, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, but they don't do that. They take the nasal swab and they've redefined the term isolation to say that we've isolated the nasal swab from the patient.
Yeah.
Because they already assume that there's a virus in the swab. So they say we've isolated the virus.
Okay.
Like that.
And then they do the opposite of isolation, namely mixing ever more stuff into that specimen. So
Yes.
if you would think that they would purify the specimen to go looking for these little viruses, it's the exact opposite. And maybe you can give a breakdown on what they add, because I think it's important for the future of the debate.
Yeah, it's really crucial, and Mike Stone can probably add even more here.
Or Mike, if
Mike, do you want to hop in and talk about
sure.
the steps?
Just about what they add to it.
Yes, all the steps.
I mean,
so now we have the specimen. What is the first thing that they add? Because it's like 4 or 5 or 6 things that they add.
Yeah, normally what I see is what they do is they add it to what's called a viral transport media first, which is basically a combination of antibiotics, antifungals. They have something called minimal essential media, nutrient media, which is supposed to be, what the virus or the cells are supposed to use to stay alive, but it's not physiologically close to what's in a human body. And so they also will have something called fetal bovine serum taken from the...
Sorry, Mike, let's not go too fast. I really want to break this down for people who are new.
Oh, you're fine. Yeah.
So we have the nasal swab, we have that specimen.
Right.
Then the first thing you say is they put it on a medium that makes it able to transport, and that medium consists of antibiotics, which to me, my first question would be, why antibiotics? Why would they add that? From their point of view, why would that be useful?
Yeah, it's supposed to control bacteria, like any bacteria that is supposedly, or it's going to be in the sample. They're doing it to destroy any sort of contamination. Yeah. But it's all, it's going to alter the sample no matter what.
And bacteria also have RNA. They have genetic material. So if you kill the bacteria with the antibiotics, you already have a second source of DNA and RNA material that you would have to filter if you would want to get the virus. Am I correct?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. And then so the solution, because in the documentary it said you can add antibiotics, you can do whatever you want, and the tissue still does not die. And it's only because you don't feed it enough that it actually dies. So
the starving.
Yeah, the starving. Why would they want to starve it?
Well, the antibiotics, I have seen papers that say that, the antibiotics themselves can cause what they call the cytopathogenic effect that they're looking for during these cell culture experiments. I think it just depends on the amount used and the length of time that they are culturing the cells for. But as far as starving the cells, I believe it's supposed to keep them in like all the cells in the same state, like so that they're not growing at different rates, if I remember correctly. It's been a while since I looked at that, but if I remember correctly, that's what they're doing when they're starving the cells.
Mm-hmm.
They're trying to get them all in the same growth cycle, same state.
And then you were adding, or they are adding bovine fetal serum, BFS. What function does that have in their mind?
Right. It's supposed to be supplying the cell with the nutrients or whatever it is to sustain it to grow. But that in and of itself, just like the bacteria and everything, is another source of RNA, because they're taking it directly from the blood of the heart of an unborn calf, and they don't filter it or do anything. It's very variable, so they don't have the same amount of like micro macronutrients and everything in the different FBS that they use. So I've seen papers that have stated that just the fetal bovine serum alone is enough that the RNA will be sequenced along with the virus, the supposed virus. So, they're taking that genetic material and mixing it with the human genetic material, and you're going to have, different microorganisms, bacteria, things like that.
So we have already 3 sources of genetic material: that from the specimen coming from a human being, that from the bacteria breaking down by the antibiotics, and that from the serum, which is full of RNA coming from an unborn calf, a fetus. And might I add, I will let you continue, but might I add, there is one aspect that you didn't discuss in your documentary, Michael, and that is that every year 2 million cows are being killed, or at least mistreated, because this bovine fetal serum, they have to get it out of the calf, or the fetus actually of a calf, without sedating the animal.
Exactly.
I didn't know if you knew that, but I didn't see it in your documentary. And that alone, to me, spiritually, if they inject that into you, we're not even talking about science, but the energy surrounding all of that, it's terrible.
It's terrible. I mean, most people know the name Jonas Salk as one of the great inventors of the polio vaccine. One of the reasons that Salk was able to propel himself to such fame is that he cornered the market on monkey kidneys. He went out and he just bought all the monkeys he could find, so that there were few other researchers could even find the monkeys, because he had these huge laboratories in which he was extracting kidneys.
Vero cells. Because back to Mike, that would be the next thing they add. So we have already 3 things: the specimen, the antibiotics, the bovine fetal serum, and then they they inoculate it into
a cell culture, which is going to contain a lot of those same ingredients already, just to maintain the cell. But so it's just a massive amount of different chemicals, sources of RNA, as you pointed out, that are going into that petri dish and being mixed together. So it's entirely the exact opposite of what you would normally associate with isolation.
Yeah, that's the funny thing, and that's what makes it so hard to believe for people, that it's so perverted, but so almost diabolically perverted, that nobody could even imagine that they would twist meaning in such an incredible way. And it took me like half a year to say, is this possible that people conduct experiments with their tubes every day and they cannot even see that the meaning of isolation has been perverted? How do you feel about that? I had the biggest trouble understanding.
It's shocking.
Not funny. It's sometimes it's funny.
Shocking.
But there are 25,000 universities in the world. I did the calculations last night, and let's say that one third has a virologist, because not all universities have them. That would be anywhere between 8,000 and 10,000 virologists in the world, and none of them. Okay, you have Dr. Stefan Lanka, you have some guys, and none of them actually understands that isolating is the opposite of mixing. How can you understand that? I'm still boggled by the normitude of that.
It's the normative. I'm equally boggled, but I think that we live in a society in which these practices are enculturated. All of the training, all of the pressure. If you begin to question it, then it's you're pretty quickly shown the door. And so the only people who survive in the field are the people who are going to repeat these practices. Mm-hmm. And the people who essentially they've drank the Kool-Aid and they're full believers. You're not going to you're not going to get to be a cardinal in the Catholic religion unless you're able to regurgitate the practices that the church requires you to participate in. Mm-hmm. So I think that this is just, as David Rasnick, a biochemist in the film says, he says, look, science is dead. I asked him about, what's going on with science. He said, there's nothing going on with science. There is no science. It's just technologists who are using fancy equipment and who are, being given a set of instructions and who are following the instructions, but who aren't questioning them, who aren't thinking foundationally. It's very hard to find that. And I spoke with, he's not in the film, but there's a fabulous writer named Leeman McHenry who wrote a book called The Illusion of Evidence-Based Medicine. And he's a philosopher of science. He's taught philosophy of science for 25 years, and about 25 years into it, he's taught for longer now, but about 25 years into teaching, he was asked to testify in a legal case against a pharmaceutical company. And he said, my whole life I've been teaching about the ideals of science and the fantastic culmination of our society really in the scientific method. He said, but I had no idea until I actually began looking at the practiced science that it was nothing like that. It was absolutely nothing like that. So we have this imaginary world again of what we think science is, but then we have the actual practices of what's going on in order to maintain grants, in order to advance careers, and in order to participate in a field that has now been structured essentially in how it thinks. That's my take. Is it?
Yeah, we'll come back to that, because I also think that it has to do with a certain philosophical premise, which is materialism and dualism. But we'll come back to that. I will continue with Mike now. Now we have this brew. There's no other name for it, and now we go to what they call infection experiments. Could you perhaps elaborate a bit on that?
Are you talking about in terms of what they do with animals?
No, I think we have to track the whole process so that people can understand.
Right.
So now we are at the point they have taken the nasal swab, they mixed it with everything. Now they have cell culture, and now all of a sudden they start saying we see viruses, but they are not viruses. They are something else. What are they then?
Well, yeah, what they're looking at, or what they're looking for, it's called the cytopathogenic effect, which, from my understanding, is just, primarily the breakdown of the cells, because they've been, put in a toxic state with all the different additives and that have been included in the petri dish. So they look for these patterns of cell death, and from recognizing a certain pattern, they claim, if they see that's where the virus is. It's within that soup. If they don't see it, then they assume there is no virus. Though there are viruses that don't cause a cytopathogenic effect, and they still claim that they're within the cell culture. So it's
so to recapitulate, they have never seen the virus, but the cell dies because of the cell can die for any reason, actually. But they say, well, look, the cell dies, so it has to be a virus.
Yeah, there's numerous reasons, numerous other causes that can create that same effect. Just like I said, just the antibiotics alone can cause a cytopathogenic effect. The age of the cells, the passaging, what they do, they take from one culture, take the supernatant and put it into another culture, passage it. That can cause the cytopathogenic effect. There's a lot of different things. So if they see that, it's again, like Michael was talking about, it's an assumption. They assume that by seeing this effect, there's a virus within their culture, and then they will take that, and that's when they break it down into, the images for the particles.
Yes. And now there's a crucial phase, and that would be to devise control experiments to eliminate all other possible causes. Right. So from Dr. Lanka, with whom I had the honor of, I think, calling 3 hours or something, he says that these control experiments do not exist. Is that also what you have found, or do they exist and they're faulty? How are those?
Well, I mean, they do what they call mock infections or mock cultures, which is basically just taking a cell. I mean, it's very hard to find any like actual outline or methods that they use for these mock infection controls, but from my understanding, they just take the cell and add some of the same ingredients, like the antibiotics, antifungals, the nutrient media, things like that. But what they don't do, which they should be doing, is taking a sample from a healthy human and adding it into there as well to see if they generate the same effect. They never do that. I've never seen them take samples from healthy humans, and they're typically just small sample sizes, which, you know, again, you want to show that the process is repeatable, that you're getting the same results every time, and you don't see that.
Yeah, but would that be a valid control experiment, though? I think the most valid control experiment would be the exact same setup minus the specimen isolated from the patient. And then you could see if the cell dies anyway, well, it has to be some antibiotics of...
They do that. Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. They don't look at each of these things individually to see. I mean, they have had some studies, but they don't look at them each individually. But if they wanted to control every variable, yeah, you would do it that way. You would do it with a sick sample. You do it with a healthy sample. You do multiple different kinds of controls to see what could potentially be causing this effect, if they're getting it the same way every time or not.
Yeah, and to my knowledge, they don't do it. They don't. They simply don't. They mock infections. What is that then? With a healthy person? No, not even that. No. What is a mock infection? No. What is that?
Well, that's the thing. It's very hard to figure out exactly what they're doing besides the same steps with the cell, but the same process without the supposed virus material in there. Though I do know that there's been other studies where they use a completely different cell than the one that they're studying. They'll use different concentrations of the chemicals and things like that. So but if you're trying to look for the exact steps, I myself have a very difficult time trying to find out what these mock infections are, rather than them saying we performed mock controls.
I've spent 2 years digging into the literature, and I simply want somebody to tell me, this is the experiment we have. There are 5 factors in that experiment. This is the control experiment. We have eliminated 4. And now we are positively sure that that cannot be the factor. And that does not exist. So this is not science.
Right.
So as simple as that. And all the rest, PCR and vaccines and whatever. Okay, but let's dig deeper into the rabbit hole now. And now we have these infection experiments, which are not true scientific experiments. Okay. But then there's another step. And that's even more virtual. And that's, then you have the cytopathic effect, in which all those pieces of RNA from all those different sources are in the mud, in that mixture. And then they start, biochemically determining that. Can you speak about that? We're not even talking about sequencing. Now we have to determine all those pieces, like 100 nucleotides or 1,000, and put them into a database, if I'm correct.
You're talking about as they go through and try to create the genome?
Yes. So they eventually want to sequence.
Yeah, I mean, what they do is they take, from my understanding, they take the sample and they use different like chemical means to break up the RNA within the sample. And so it's going to be a mixture of, it's not just virus RNA or viral RNA, whatever that is. It's all of the things that are within that sample. They break it down into RNA so that they can eventually take that. There's multiple steps. They have to fragment it through various means, and eventually take the RNA and convert it to what they call complementary DNA, because the RT-PCR process doesn't work with RNA. They have to first change it into the cDNA. And so there's multiple steps. Like the thing that I found is there are so many variables and so many steps that the sample goes through to get to that point where it becomes a genome, that there's no way it can reflect, reality or what is in nature. But yeah, it will go through the breaking of the sample into the RNA. They create these fragments that they will use to create the cDNA, and then from there, that's when they prepare the library to eventually.
That's it, the library.
Yeah.
The library. They call it the library because it contains all the bits and pieces of the things that they have broken down.
Exactly.
And the gentleman with the white beard, I don't know what his name is, the biochemist.
David Rasnick.
Yeah, he raised an important point. He said, that's not even, we cannot even call that sequencing, because the true sequencing is the Sanger sequencing, where you take an isolated piece of RNA, let's say 1,000 nucleotides, and you biochemically determine one nucleotide, you cut it off, and then you cut another one off, and then you're sure that it's the same thing. But here in this process, first of all, we have 4 sources of RNA. And then, you know, in that soup of letters, we all index them, we put them into a library, which is basically a database like Illumina. And then, Mike, then the next step would be to assemble those, align those, that's the official term, alignment, into what?
Exactly, into the theoretical genome, which no one can see unless you're looking at a computer. But yeah, it's assembly, just creating. I look at it as it's just basically taking a bunch of random puzzle pieces and trying to put together a picture of a puzzle you've never seen before. Sometimes, I mean, they use
one puzzle. Sorry to interrupt, but assuming it's 4 puzzles.
Yeah. Oh yeah, exactly. That's what I'm saying. It's just a bunch of random, not even from the same puzzle. I mean, it might not even be puzzle pieces. You might have, you know, different toys and other things within there. You know, it's just so random. But then they're using, you know, reference genomes from other virus. Like in this case, they used the rat, or no, yeah, a bat virus, rat BG14 or something like that. They tried to compare it to the original SARS genome. And so you have to then say, well, were those genomes, how were they created?
The ontogenetic question.
Exactly. And so then when you look into those, like just the bat virus that it's the most closely related to, they came and find the sample in order to even repeat the experiment to get the genome. I mean, it's a very mysterious origin in and of itself. SARS-CoV-1 created the same way, unpurified materials, not isolated virus. I mean, you have to keep going back and back and back and looking at how these genomes were created. And you can see that none of them ever came from an actual purified isolated virus source, not a single one.
And that is very interesting, because that, when I understood that, it made me also understand how it is possible that everybody believes in this illusion, because you have high specialization in this sector and nobody ever really checks what the neighbor has done. And they assume that, you know, that genome has been sequenced from a true isolated specimen. And everybody thinks that. And that's why 8,000 people, you know, can rule the world.
Yeah, and if you don't, or if you question it, then they cut you off. It's all compartmentalized too. I mean, you know, the virologists do their thing, the geneticists do their thing, you know, immunologists do their thing. No one really goes around and checks and does the work necessary to make sure that these results from the experiments are accurate, which is why there's such a huge reproducibility crisis in the sciences right now. They cannot reproduce the results. They can't replicate them.
Which is broader than only virology, everywhere, same thing. So yeah.
Exactly.
Okay, so now we have broken down the so-called scientific process. These bits and pieces are assembled, but the whole thing is there is no model. There's no empirical model. You have no isolation. There is a theoretical model that they then use as a reference. You dive into that, and then you find, they use another model. You dive into that, and it's like an infinite regress.
Exactly.
Virtual, it's like the Matrix, basically. Fractals, you know, fractals of illusion. And on a philosophical level, it's very inspiring for me, but that's for later. And then one last thing that really convinces people, and that is the imaging. Let's talk about that. So now we have a sequence that is already very impressive, because, you know, 29,998 nucleotides. What a job that must have been to isolate all of those thingies. No, just a computer program, but okay. But now we have the the final proof, and that is the image. And the image is stronger than the word always.
Well, yeah, a picture is worth 1,000 words. You know, that's seen. You know, seeing is believing. People see that image. To me, it's a marketing tool. You know, they have that image so ingrained in everyone's minds now of the circle with the little spikes coming out of it. Do they see that every time? No. I mean, I've seen studies where they show an image which is just an ordinary circle, and they'll point and say, "Look, there's the spikes. You can't even see the spikes." So they can't recreate the same picture every time. And
maybe it was a baby virus that still did not have the spikes.
Yeah, it was like just coming out. No, I've actually, oddly enough, I've seen them say that they're just forming. It's absolutely ridiculous the excuses that we come up with. But yeah, the EM, the electron microscope process. I mean, again, you're starting from a culture which is not purified and isolated. So there's I've seen estimates of upwards of millions of similar and identical particles that are going to be within that sample. I mean, you're going to have, you know, most likely different bacteria, micro organisms, exosomes, which are supposedly the exact same thing as a virus without the infectivity aspect of it. And so they've admitted they can't separate those out. So you're going to have a mixture of many different particles that look either the exact same or, you know, similar. And so to then sit there and claim that whichever particle that you're picking out in your electron microscope image is the virus, when there's multiple other particles that could potentially be the same thing, it's not logical. It makes no sense.
Yeah, but how do you? The point is actually, as I see it, that you can photograph a supposed virus and say that it is a virus, but the only way to be sure that it is a virus, which means an agent that can infect and make somebody ill, is to then take that particle and to put it into a human being. But the preparation of the EM photo makes that totally impossible.
It destroys. Nothing can be imaged in an electron microscope alive. It has to be basically killed first. And so, you know, you're already taking something that's been altered numerous times throughout the cell culture experiment, and then they do what they call fixing of the samples. So it has to be fixed in a state with, I believe they use chemicals like paraformaldehyde or glutaraldehyde to
get the water out.
Yeah, well, that'll come afterwards. They fix it first with these. They'll stain it with heavy metals so
Platinum.
that they can get a contrast. What's that?
I've read that the most used coating is platinum.
Oh yeah, and yeah, I've seen platinum, lead, different things. And then after that, they'll dehydrate it, which is what you're talking about. They'll increase the level of ethanol and dehydrate. I mean, are you familiar with the work of Harold Hillman?
Of course, evidence-based biology. I love the book.
Yeah, I sadly I have to delve into his work more, but from what I've seen, I mean, he outlined exactly how each of these processes alters a sample in some way. Just the dehydration alone is going to change the morphological characteristics of the sample. And then you're taking that dehydrated sample and, you know, embedding it in resin and cutting it into even like super thin slices, which have, you know, no basis in reality either. It's not going to look the same as what came from the human. So all of these processes in some way can introduce artifacts. I think even Hillman himself said they were all artifacts, or at least the vast majority of them.
Not all, but he said, for instance, the double membrane that we always supposed to see in cells is actually a refraction artifact from the electrons refracting. And I really have to dig deeper into this because it's really interesting, but please continue.
Oh yeah, his work. Yeah, exactly. That's I'm it's one of my biggest overlooks is I need to delve into his work a lot, because the stuff that I've seen is just mind-blowing how he was able I mean, he's one of the few honest, you know, microbiologists out there. And so
I was taught in high school that there was something like the Golgi complex. And then I asked my teacher, what does it do? And she couldn't answer. And now I read with Hillman, like 25 years later, that the Golgi complex is just another refraction, just some blurb, some blot that they give it a name.
That's exactly what he said. Like these structures, they're finding structures and giving them functions and names and things. They don't know what they're doing. No. They can't see them in a live state. They're just assuming. That's why with the virus particles, it's just point and declare. They're pointing that that's the particle and giving it a function, which they can't prove. No. They can't even show that came from a human, because it's already so far away removed from reality through the various steps that it's gone through to then say, I mean, just the EM process itself is enough to question that particle or those particles, that images. But when you factor in the cell culture, it's just even more so.
Yeah. Dr. Lanka actually had a very good explanation for the apparent corona. He says these are actually, in singular, it's called vilus, but in plural, it's vili. And vili are like when tissue is trying to heal itself, it's like little fingers crawling towards the other fingers, and they attach. And if you cut that in a 2D thing, or if you cut the vili in a 2D thing, the hairs on that, if you look from one side, it's like it has a corona. That is his explanation, but you should check with him.
His work has been amazing.
Yeah, he is. And to blow your mind even more, because nowadays I do not accept anything that is not empirically, demonstrated. He actually claims, if I have understood him well, that the traditional cell, like we think about the traditional cell, does not even exist. That the only thing that exists are nuclei that are floating around with DNA in it. The nucleus exists floating in the fluids of the tissue. And he has actually an article in German about that. I'm trying to have it translated. So if that is true, then the whole idea of the receptor and then the ACE2 story and like the science fiction that we have there would also not be true. I'm not saying it isn't. I haven't investigated it enough, but when Lanka says something, I listen, because he is really, in my mind, he's genius.
Well, there's enough smoke there that you can question a lot of these things that they've told us. I mean, but without actually purifying and isolating the virus particles first, any of the things that they tell us about, like the spike protein, the ACE, like all of those things, you can't take it at face value because they've never proven those to actually come from the particle that they're claiming exists.
True. So I think with that, the illusion, we can talk about the PCR and all, but the illusion of the virus in and of itself. Michael, are we forgetting aspects that should be discussed about the illusion of the virus itself?
No, I mean, I think that I think you guys are saying it, beautifully. It's science fiction. It's the definition of pseudoscience. It's a number of scientific experiments that don't justify their own conclusions, and then all sorts of claims are made based on those experiments. To your point about the cell, Hillman has a great video on looking at brain tissue, where he takes apart the idea that brain tissue is divided into singular cells, and it's really interesting. And he looks at, and then if you look at the work of like Gilbert Ling, and who's looking at the ability of the cell, according to this science fiction story, to create energy, the story doesn't add up. It can't quite hold itself. But that's sort of beyond that's way beyond my expertise, but it's a really interesting area to look at. And at some point I would love to look at it. Just to give people if people got a little bit lost in that science, it's as if I said that, I don't know, you're in Belgium, right? Did you guys have the game Cooties when you were kids?
I don't know it.
In American schools, it's really famous that somebody would touch you. They would play tag. They would touch you, and they would say, "You have cooties." It was like a kid disease, right? You touched and you have cooties, and then
we had something similar. Yeah,
that kid runs around, and everybody says, "Oh, he's got cooties! Oh, he's got cooties!" And then that kid tries to touch somebody else, and then they get cooties, right? Okay, so it's just like a simple kids game. Well, you could do the same set of experiments, and you could find and genetically sequence the cooties virus using these experiments, okay? But the cooties virus isn't real. It's science fiction, right? But you could use these very same experiments to claim that the cooties virus has been found and it's been unleashed, and you can test for it, and we have a cooties epidemic, pandemic unfolding, and we all better do X, Y, and Z to protect ourselves from the cooties virus, because you can do the cytopathic effect in which you show cell death. You can electron microscope image this nasal swab with all of its ingredients and claim that there's the circle, so there is the cooties virus. You could then do a computer model of your hypothetical cooties virus, claim that you have sequenced it, release that sequence around the world. Other researchers around the world would then do their version of a genetic sequencing of the cooties virus.
That's still an aspect that we might touch upon, and something I learned from your documentary, and that is that all the so-called variants are actually laboratories who are taking the original genome and then use their own brew, because they have their own brew, and try to reconstruct the genome. But sometimes that fails because they cannot find the original genome. Of course, they cannot find it because every brew is different.
It's the
definition. And then they say we found about 70%, but the rest is different. So it must be a variation. It must be a variant. So it is funny, actually, if you think about it, but it's not science.
Well, there's almost like 10 million variants going on right now. If you look at the GISAID database, GISAID, whatever it's from, like almost 10 million variants.
Yeah, and it's only Delta and Omicron that we have to worry about, right?
Well, and stealth Omicron now.
Yeah. And what was the last thing we heard from Israel, that there are like two mutants marrying or something, like a mutant with a mutant.
Oh, the Deltacron. Yeah, the Deltacron. I think they call it XD.
I would be at the bar just having fun and telling jokes. I would tell something like that, but it's official.
It's ridiculous. I honestly, I cannot wrap my head around how people cannot see through it. How many variants do they have to release before people say enough? This doesn't make any sense. You've never. What flu season have we gone through where they're like multiple variants of the same flu is coming out every time within a span of a few months? It's absolutely ridiculous. But they've taken everything and accelerated it to such an absurd extent. I mean, if we're to believe this, that virus has to be mutating like every week almost.
Well,
more than that.
Oh yeah, exactly. I mean, it's just they cannot sequence the same thing every time. They're all variants of something that never has been proven to exist. I mean, it's just
because actually that is like the litmus test, isn't it? That you would be able to isolate the virus in a brew, okay, but that you would at least be able to reconstruct it's the same genome.
Right.
And the failure to do so is presented as variants.
Exactly. Repeatability. I mean, it's really basic science. I mean, really basic science that's being thrown out the window. I mean, everybody knows about control experiments. But repeatability is another, fundamental aspect of basic science, right? Like if I flip a coin while holding a banana and it lands on heads, have I proven that holding a banana will make the coin land on heads? No, that experiment has to be repeated thousands and thousands and thousands of times. But what they do is they'll do the experiment once or twice, claim the conclusion, and then concoct a sophisticated science fiction story to explain the mechanism of the conclusion without showing the repeatability of the experiment. So you know, it's literally the definition of pseudoscience, and it's run amok. The psychological question is even more interesting than this, the scientific one.
Let's go into that. Let's go into that because I think I'm trying to understand. Like by March, no, that's not true. By June, I had the idea pretty well formed on what the illusion was. But since June, I'm talking June 2020, but since June 2020 until now, I'm still trying to get my head around how such a simple illusion, because it's not that hard to deconstruct. Well, it is hard if you're in the illusion, but once you see the child's play that they are doing, it's not that hard. But how come that people, I think there's some kind of blind trust. We think that we are very rational now. We are in modernity, and like faith and the priests, we don't believe in that anymore, but we do believe in scientists. You put on a black coat or a white coat, you put DR before your name, and you're like a semi-god.
It's a new religion, so to speak.
I would say it is scientism. That's what Hayek called it. Hayek wrote an essay on scientism, like the idea of science, going through all the motions and all the, but there's no core. There's nothing behind that. So I'm flabbergasted.
Absolutely. It's totally shocking. It's a cult. I mean, you're looking at cult behavior, inculcated behavior. That you know, it started with you know, it started with the imagery of the virus to really bring everybody into that same fear state. And then, you know, I mean, in the United States, it was just, you know, it was just incredible. I mean, with the people would go out at 5 o'clock on their balconies and clap, you know, for the medical establishment. And we had the dancing nurses, you know, around the world. You know, you have these dictates from what I essentially consider cult leaders, basically saying, do not question what we say. It's dangerous. I mean, it's dangerous to question what we say. That was really put forth. This is a classic kind of cult, you know, thing. It's dangerous to question your leaders. You know, and then, you know, it ends in the ritualistic, you know, injection, self-injection. You know, I think there has to be some sort of, I mean, from my perspective, there almost has to be some sort of disappointment, you know, at the end of the whole thing, because now you've injected yourself, you've gone through this whole sort of cult process, you're expecting, you know, some kind of superpower or you know, some sort of
alleviation of anxiety, at least.
Exactly. Yeah. And you know, you're expecting like a Nietzschean experience. And you know, maybe for a half a second while you were being injected, you got that experience psychologically, spiritually, and then nothing, right? So I think that, you know, they have an issue with that, but of course, it's okay. They've solved that issue with boosters, right? Right. So you can continue to have this ritualistic experience, and that all folds together very well, but.
From my perspective as a monetary economist, I've been studying false flags for the last 20 years because I understood that the monetary system is far more than printing money. It's also making sure that people never find out that the money that they are printing comes from thin air. You always have to distract them. And so the debt levels I've seen growing since 2008, and I said to my subscribers, I really wonder which illusion that they will use to cull us all into a herd and to control us all more. And I thought it would be a second 9/11 or something like that. And I didn't see it. I saw the documentary, which also is also a very good documentary, House of Numbers. What was that, 2009, 2013?
2009, yeah.
And that is where I understood that viruses, or at least the HIV virus, had never been isolated. And you see Montagnier actually admitting it on video, admitting it. I have never isolated it. And I was flabbergasted, but it went to the back of my mind, and I never thought about virology again. And then this thing started and said, wow, that's it. That's it. That's it. That's how they are going to do it. Because from a purely economical point of view, people say, well, it's all about the money from the pharmaceutical companies. And I'm like, no, you know, a pharmaceutical company can make a lot of money out of the illness of people, but why would you need to make a profit if you can actually print money? And yeah, but that is really important. They're not after profit. They are after total control over your life. And that is what we're seeing with the QR codes. And, you know, divide et impera has always been a method. You know, if you're not vaccinated, you're a danger, what you said, Michael. And a very interesting theorist when it comes to that is not an economist. He's a psychologist from the University of Ghent, is Professor Dr. Matthias de Smet. In English, they say Desmet. And he has described the process of mass formation. So what the authorities want is a dumbed down mass that cannot think for itself anymore and just, you know, are spoon-fed lies from the television. And that's what I see happening. And I think that is what explains that a lot of people cannot see through the illusion, because they identify with a struggle against something that is evil, which is the virus, the non-existing virus. And all those who do not, you know, help in this struggle against the virus are like apostates, you know, are like the filth, the scum of the earth. And while those people, exactly the people, what we are doing are saying, hey, we are trying to save you, but they would rather burn us at the stake at some point. That's my analysis.
It's a great analysis. I mean, just look at the way. I mean, I think you're spot on with the fact that it's all about control, and the weapon is fear. You know, fear is a powerful tool. I just go back to when I first, you know, heard about this and the imagery that we were seeing of people just dropping dead in the streets and in China, or these vans that were taking contaminated people away, the white vans. They always had them lined up in four, so it always looked like to me like the four horsemen of the apocalypse going.
There's a lot of symbology. There's a lot
of symbology, and I think these images, these initial images from China, were ingrained in people's brains, and you know, that helps start the cycle of fear. Oh, is this going to come here? No, it's not. But then they've also kept us on this guessing game where they would say one thing, like, no, masks aren't necessary. No, they're now necessary. Maybe they're not necessary. Asymptomatic people, yeah, you have to fear them. No, you don't have to fear them. It's kept us in this state of design confusion where we don't know what's going on. And that helps to heighten that fear and keep us.
That's actually a technique, Mike, from the Biederman chart of coercion. I don't know if you have ever heard of that.
No, I haven't actually.
Biederman was a psychologist who studied the POWs that came back from the Korean camps, and they had been subjected to psychological torture by changing the rules constantly. And so, if you do that, you create a brain fog. There's like this screen of fog, and you cannot think clearly because the only thing you want is the fear to go away. And that is exactly the moment where they plug new measures, because you won't even react. You're just brain fogged. You don't see it. So
yeah, the masks is another aspect of exactly what you're talking about, Brecht. You know, I read a study, very interesting study. Basically said, you know, when a new threat emerges, people need an action to take. And if they don't have an action that they can take, they will essentially compartmentalize and essentially forget about the fear, because there's really no other way to deal with it. You just sort of push it aside, sort of like thermonuclear war. Like, we all grew up, you know, with the threat of thermonuclear war that was always hanging over our heads. But at the end of the day, it didn't really change your behavior because there was nothing you could do about it, right? So I think that the masks was a huge marketing step forward in that fear sense, because what they were able to do was give people something they could do to ameliorate the threat. And by giving people this activity, what they were able to actually keep the fear present in people's consciousness in a way that it wouldn't have naturally. It would have just gone away on its own.
Yep.
But by wearing the mask, it was a constant reminder of the fear and the possibility of what could happen.
Yeah. And the Wuhan people falling down, you have a great journalist in the States. His name is John Rappaport. I read everything he writes. And he actually found out that Wuhan is the epicenter of the production of fentanyl, which is 100 times more powerful than morphine. And one of the characteristics of fentanyl is that it, when you metabolize it, it uses up all the oxygen in your body. So all the oxygen in your hemoglobin goes to trying to metabolize fentanyl. And what happens is that you get hypoxia and you just fall over. So we're not even sure that the people who fell over were falling over because of COVID. It might be just, you know.
No, I'm 100% sure they weren't falling over because of COVID.
No, I think a lot of it was propaganda. But I think like, oh, I'm sorry.
I just want to add that as Stefan Scolio points out in the doc, you know, Wuhan is the center of virology in China, and it was in Wuhan where they had just put forward a new vaccine mandates just that year, in which, you know, they were vaccinating the adult population, and as we've seen, it's now like patently obvious that that people will collapse from the vaccine. So you know, there's no mystery as to why people might have been collapsing, but again, the fear of the new virus plays a fantastic ideological role in pushing all of that aside in the public consciousness and in the political realm of behavior and what's allowed to be talked about. Putting all that aside and saying no, it's this.
Yeah, I would like to take this conversation a level higher, and that would be, well, no. First, I have a few constructive criticisms, if you allow me, Michael.
Always.
Yeah. Well, because your take on the Spanish flu, for instance. There are a lot of theories about that. The only thing I know is that this doctor, his name I think is Morgenthau. If I'm not, no, he's not. It's not Morgenthau. It's something. It escapes me now. He did all these experiments with the sailors, the infection experiments with the Spanish flu.
Rosenau, Milton Rosenau.
Rosenau. Thank you. That was Morgenthau. Was the Morgenthau plan? That's something different. That's from my sector, economy. Rosenau, and this guy, you know. 3 years of experiments, I think 8 different experiments, and he just had to conclude, honestly, I cannot claim that the Spanish flu is a contagious disease. And so if we have a hole in our explanation, it's only natural to take the first other material cause that we see. And in your documentary, you go towards toxicity. And toxicity, of course, is a factor, to my mind, that will weaken the body. But before the body really falls ill of toxicity, it can take a long time. And the best explanation I have heard, and this is not to monopolize the conversation or the debate, is the explanation that came from the people that are into German New Medicine. And what they say is that illness, because we need another explanation for illness. If it's not a virus, because this is the philosophical part. As long as you believe in dualism, it will be something outside of us that has to make us ill. And the whole genesis of virology comes from the fact that for a certain disease, they could not find a bacteria. And they said, there has to be something smaller that we cannot see right now. So I think the paradigm has to shift from dualism to holism. And then you go into all those alternative theories, and it's a jungle, you know, holism is a jungle. But the best explanation I have heard was that we actually fall ill because of shocks. if we get a shock, a biological shock, it does not have to be, well, I'm not going to get into that far, but we become what they call conflict active. And conflict active means I cannot place this shock. I cannot place it in my philosophy. And so what happens, the body adapts the tissues to be able to absorb the shock. And once the person has been able to give the shock a place, for instance, my wife has died in a car crash, you are conflict active for a year about that. And the moment you can place that, you know, she's gone, I have to carry on with my life, then the body says, well, the adaptations of the tissue that we did are no longer needed, and we are going to take them away. And that's when the inflammations start, because the inflammations activate the bacteria that live in us. And these bacteria do two things: or they take away tissue that has been created extra, or they replenish tissue that has gone. That is the basic theory. And why am I saying all of this? Because the Spanish flu, and it didn't mention it in the documentary, only started at the end of the war. And the conditions in the trenches have been described perfectly by that couple. I don't know their names, the Walkers, I think. How are they called? Man and wife.
Don Lester and David Parker.
Yeah. The conditions were horrible. People, you know, rats, fleas, malnutrition, anxiety, all the possible conditions to have an epidemia in the trenches. And there was nothing. There's no record of any epidemic. Why did it start after the war? Well, because that was the moment that people came out of the conflict active phase and went into the healing phase. And the healing phase involves inflammation. And so the biggest characteristic of the Spanish flu is lung inflammation. And the goal of lung inflammation is to take away the tissue that has been created extra in the conflict active phase. And what tissue was that? Well, lung tissue, of course, because if you are fighting, you need more oxygen in your blood. And so the body says, well, let's create more tissue. And this has been proven clinically that the tuberculosis bacteria is actually eating away that extra tissue that has been created in the conflict active phase. So I don't want to redo your whole documentary, but I think we should leave behind materialistic explanations that come from dualism and go to holistic explanations that are not too far-fetched, but that have some logic to it, biological.
No, I don't disagree with you, Brecht. I think that's a brilliant point. Absolutely. You know, I think that for me, the most important thing, because it's such a strong superstition in our society, is the virus. And I really wanted to sweep that away. You could sweep it away with materialist, you know.
Another materialist explanation.
Another materialist explanation.
Maybe that's a good strategy, actually.
You know, and then you have to open up the space where we can begin to ask these more fundamental questions of, you know, why do we get sick? How do we maintain health? You know, even more fundamental questions about philosophically, what are we, and, you know, how do we operate in the world? You know, but I mean,
you're right. Actually,
I'll vouch for what you're saying, Brecht. I mean, you know.
No, but strategically, you are right. Purely strategically, to be able to convince a person, you could say, well, no, it's toxicity or radiation. That's another materialist explanation, but at least it's not a virus. At least we don't have to vaccinate against that. So that's good. Smart.
And we need to open it up, because politically and philosophically, we want to move from, you know, what I want to try to accomplish is move the conversation from this dead end, that is a superstition and is not helping anybody, and open that up so that we can begin to ask these questions intellectually, in academics, in, you know, conversations with each other, and then politically, institutionally. We have to be opening up these issues instead of shutting them down.
Yeah, and not plug our own agenda, because I think to deconstruct a faulty theory is already a big, you know, a big feat, you know. So I think we should talk about how we can promote your documentary the best we can, because now there are 200 people viewing this, but later on in the YouTube video, if we are not censored, if we would be censored, it would be an honor, on how we can all help to, to spread the word, because CNN is not going to show your documentary.
Yeah, I mean, just to give an example of that, 2 days ago, I issued a press release about the documentary through the normal press release mechanism in the United States, and 10 minutes after issuing the press release, I got a phone call that PR Newswire, which is the company that issues press releases, was refusing to even release the press release.
Okay.
So it normally would have gone to 100,000 journalists across the country, as all press releases do. And then the journalists decide whether they think it's newsworthy or not newsworthy, right? If Gucci's come out with a new shoe, some magazines are going to run it and some aren't. They don't care, right? So it's up to the journalist to decide what they're going to cover. But in this case, with this conversation, PR Newswire stopped that, cut it off at the head before, they decided themselves. It's not even a subject that American journalists are allowed to consider.
They're gatekeepers. They are gatekeepers.
Yeah.
I must say it's very well coordinated, and this also, you can be a conspiracy theorist, but you don't even have to be a conspiracy theorist. You can just look at Event 201, where they literally say that they have to, centralize the perception, and this is an example, I think.
Yeah, absolutely, and there's another. I'll just keep raising the stakes, and then hopefully people will continue to come up with creative solutions, because there's also a real hesitance among the activist community to dive into these issues, because they're relatively esoteric. They're the whole way that virology works is through occult obfuscation, right? I mean, this is experiments that are done that are essentially hidden in a Latinese script.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of doctors and scientists who are scared to broach this topic themselves, because they don't want to be proven wrong, 3 months from now.
Yeah, it's understandable.
And it's totally understandable. But when you realize that the whole thing is science fiction, and the whole table needs to be turned over. You realize that the only way to do that, the only way to do that is by sharing it on a grassroots level. It's Blanca, Cowan, Kaufman, Stefan Scolio. These are in a lot of ways, they're the Martin Buber of our day. And you cannot turn to the Catholic Church to upend the Catholic Church. This is a science fiction story. This is a religious story that people have to recognize and reject for themselves. And
yes.
there's no other way.
Yeah, I want to come back to Professor Desmet, who really pinpointed it, and they are translating his book right now as we speak, and like in 4 months' time you will be able to read it in English. And he actually describes how you need 4 conditions to form a mass. You need a free-floating anxiety that has no object, and that is modernity. There's what do we have to believe? There's so much fear, and then there's an object of fear, and then you can project all your fear on that. And above that, it gives you identity, and everything you can do to combat this enemy, even sacrifice your own children by injecting them with, I would say, graphene oxide. I think that's pretty clear now that it's in the vaccines. Even if they know that, even if they might know that it is not healthy, and even if intellectually they know that Michael Wallach may be right, then they would still do it, he says. They would still do it because it's meaningful to them, because it's a ritual, because it's religion. So I think you have tackled that aspect really well. What I propose now is I share my screen again, and we go to the website, and I show how people can register, because you have to explain a bit on how the website is structured. There is a part you can see for free, And I think that part is around, where am I here? 2 hours already. Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So, and to make it dummy proof, I have actually created an email, viral delusion dummy, just to show how easy the process is. If I don't use my buttons correctly, yes, at gmail.com. Oh, whatever. And then, okay. Has already been taken. Delusion dummy, whatever. Just to show how straightforward it is. It's 0, okay, complete. So people have no excuse not to do it. Okay, so if I go now to the login page, I immediately can see I'm signed in, and I can see the first. No, this was the trailer. Sorry. Let me go back. I can see episode 1, and that's a full 2 hours. So, and I think you have done a good job of collecting bits and pieces of all the episodes. And then if people want to see the next one, then you have to pay. Then you have to click Get Access Now, and it's $11.99. And you told me, Michael, that for my subscribers, so not for the viewers of this video, but for the subscribers of Macro Trends, you had a discount.
Yeah, a discount.
Don't mention the code. Don't mention the code, because otherwise.
Brecht, I'll let you pass that out. But we'll put together a little bit of a discount.
Good.
So
it's already ridiculous, you know.
No excuse not to learn this information.
Yeah, it's ridiculous actually. For 12 euros, you get great information. But you know, I like to give my subscribers the edge. And I can tell you the 200 people that were that are following this now, they have donated 200 euros to your cause. So that compensates a bit, I guess. But we will continue. So yeah, the customer information, that's basically it. Well, my card number, I will not put it in now, but then you can easily get access to the other ones. And I must say it's well done. So I can, encourage everybody to just hook up. How many people have registered so far?
About 10,000.
Wow, that's not bad. Yeah. That's not bad at all.
Yeah.
So I will leave my screen sharing for what it is. And well, I think we've covered pretty much everything. Are there things you would like to add, Mike or Michael?
Let me give you a little plug, Mike. Mike and I met, and we know each other because there was a really brilliant journalist named David Crow who has been covering. He's been covering this issue for about 30 years now, and he started a Facebook group and for people who are interested in exploring this. And Mike and I met. And there was this huge hole in the literature because whereas the orthodox narrative has been repeated in these experiments, thousands of times, the criticism is very hard to come by. And what Mike has done so brilliantly is go back through the papers and lay out for people exactly what the scientific record on these questions is. So, you can go to Mike's blog and you can dig into the electron micrograph scientific record on, say, the photographs of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. You can go to his blog and you can, you can look at the purification isolation question. You can look at the genetic sequencing question. You can look at all these things, and he's really combed through the papers to say, here's the, here's the data. Here's what the record says. So I think that we kind of have a 1-2 punch where you'll get a really, I think, good scope of the story and the narrative of what's going on now and what's happened historically from the film. And then you can see the verification for yourself on Mike's blog. Good,
very good.
Thank you.
So for everybody, Mike's blog is virology.com, and I've been there numerous times for, to inform myself of subtleties in the debate, because sometimes somebody rebuts you with something you don't know, and then you feel stupid because, gee, he might be right, and then you go to the blog of Mike and you search for the term, and then he has an article on it already. So that's really nice. Yeah. So I think, gentlemen, with this we have had a good conversation, and we should follow up. So maybe in half a year's time we do another conversation, and we'll see how the debate has evolved.
Well, that sounds great, Brecht.
Good.
Appreciate it.
You have a full Sunday ahead. Here it's 4:30, but it's nice weather. I'll go for a walk, I think.
Good idea.
That sounds great. Hopefully we can dig into questions of materialism and questions of mass formation and all of these really interesting questions, because once you realize that the science is bunk, it brings up much more interesting questions about what's really going on in the world. So I hope that we get to have that conversation.
Sure. I'm sure the contact has been made, and your work is excellent. And let's just stay in touch and see what happens. See how the madness evolves, and how the snake bites his own tail. Because what they will have to invent now to get out of the contradictions. I'm actually sitting like with popcorn, waiting like what is going to happen now. So that'll be fun.
Yeah. Brecht, thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
It's my pleasure.
Yeah.
Have a nice day, and talk to you soon.